The Vietnam War is one of the most fiercely debated conflicts in modern history. Ask 100 people whether the United States truly lost, and you'll get 100 different answers, each shaped by politics, emotion, and the stories they were told growing up. Some say America lost militarily. Others insist it lost politically. Some argue the U.S. didn't lose at all, because Vietnam was never meant to be won in the traditional sense. But the truth, as always, is more complicated than a simple yes or no. Today, we're diving deep into what actually happened, why the war unfolded the way it did, and what it really means to lose a war as complex as this one. To understand the ending, we have to go back to the beginning. Vietnam wasn't just a battlefield, it was a symbol of the global struggle between communism and capitalism during the Cold War. For the United States, Vietnam was not merely a distant country, it was a domino. American leaders genuinely believed that if one nation in Southeast Asia fell to communism, the rest would follow. This belief, known as the domino theory, drove the U.S. into a conflict it wasn't prepared to navigate. The irony is that Vietnam's internal struggle for independence had been going on long before the Cold War existed, but America entered with the assumption that it was fighting a global ideological enemy rather than a nationalist movement with deep historical roots. When U.S. troops arrived, they faced a type of warfare unlike anything the American military had encountered before. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army weren't fighting a traditional war. They didn't rely on front lines, heavy machinery, or predictable formations. They used the jungle itself as a weapon. They used traps, tunnels, ambushes, and a level of patience that shocked American commanders. Their goal wasn't to defeat the United States militarily, it was to outlast them. To resist, delay, and grind down America's political will until withdrawal became more attractive than staying. And that strategy worked. The U.S. military, despite having vastly superior weapons, technology, training, and funding, found itself fighting ghosts. They would capture territory during the day only to lose it again at night. They would win battles, only to realize that the enemy had simply melted back into the countryside. By traditional metrics, the U.S. won nearly every major battle of the war. But wars are not won by battles alone. Wars are won by objectives. And the Viet Cong's objective was never to destroy the U.S. military, it was to make the United States decide the war wasn't worth continuing. Meanwhile, back home, something unprecedented was happening. The American public was watching the war on television. For the first time in history, the brutality of conflict entered American living rooms every evening. Graphic images of casualties, burning villages, and frightened soldiers eroded the government's narrative that victory was around the corner. Public support plummeted. Young Americans questioned the draft. College campuses erupted in protest. For many, the war no longer made moral or strategic sense. This internal collapse, public resistance, political pressure, and cultural upheaval became one of the most decisive fronts of the war. The U.S. military was fighting in Vietnam, but America itself was battling at home. Historian Douglas Pike once said, "The primary war was fought in Vietnam, but the decisive war was fought in the United States." It is one of the rare conflicts where the home front played a more critical role than the battlefield. As the war dragged on, American leaders faced a brutal reality: staying meant an endless commitment with no clear path to victory. Leaving meant accepting the possibility that South Vietnam would fall, something many considered unacceptable. Yet after years of casualties, financial strain, and political division, the U.S. finally chose to withdraw. Not because it was defeated in battle, but because the cost of staying outweighed the perceived benefits. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, and American troops began their final exit. This is where the debate intensifies. Some argue the United States did not lose the war, it simply left it. After all, South Vietnam still existed for 2 more years after America's withdrawal. The U.S. promised continued aid, but when Congress refused further support, South Vietnam was left alone against a fully backed North Vietnamese force. In 1975, Saigon fell, marking the official end of the conflict. Images of desperate civilians clinging to helicopters became symbols not only of defeat but of abandonment. So did America lose? The answer depends on how you define losing. If the objective was to prevent a communist takeover in South Vietnam, then yes, the U.S. failed. If the objective was to destroy North Vietnam militarily, the U.S. also failed. But if the objective was to demonstrate American resolve, contain communist expansion, and prove that the U.S. would intervene globally during the Cold War, some argue America partially succeeded. The war sent a message controversial, costly, but influential about the lengths the United States was willing to go in order to oppose communism. But let's dig deeper. Wars are not only measured by military outcomes. They're measured by impact. The Vietnam War caused profound changes in American society. It reshaped public trust in government. It led to new laws limiting presidential war powers. It reshaped foreign policy, making U.S. leaders more cautious about long-term, open-ended conflicts. In this sense, the war left a legacy of lessons, harsh, painful lessons that continue to influence decision-making today. For Vietnam, the war was a completely different story. For them, it was a fight for unification and independence, a long continuation of their struggle against colonialism. They viewed their victory not as a global communist triumph, but as a national achievement. Despite suffering millions of casualties, devastating environmental damage, and economic collapse, they accomplished their core goal, a unified Vietnam under a single government. There's also a crucial point often overlooked, the Vietnamese perspective on America's withdrawal. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the mastermind behind many strategies of the North Vietnamese, once said that the U.S. military was never beaten, it simply gave up. Whether that's propaganda, truth, or something in between, it reflects how the Vietnamese leadership viewed the conflict as a test of endurance, not firepower. Looking at the war through this lens, the question, did the U.S. lose, becomes incomplete. The deeper question is, what was America trying to win? Without a clear definition, no victory was ever truly possible. Today, historians still debate the meaning of the Vietnam War. Some label it America's greatest military failure. Others argue it was a political failure rather than a battlefield one. Some insist it was an unwinnable war from the start due to cultural misunderstandings and unrealistic objectives. And others believe that withdrawal was the only rational decision, given the circumstances. So where does that leave us? The truth is that the Vietnam War was not a simple victory for one side and a defeat for the other. It was a costly, complicated, deeply human tragedy that reshaped both nations forever. The United States may not have been militarily defeated, but the political and social consequences of its involvement created a reality in which staying became impossible. And in the end, that was enough for history to label the war a loss. If there's a lesson to take away, it's that wars are rarely as straightforward as they appear in textbooks. They are influenced by ideology, emotion, leadership, public opinion, and the unpredictable will of the people who fight them. Vietnam was no exception. It was a tangled conflict with tangled outcomes, a war that ended not because one side was completely destroyed, but because the other decided it had lost too much already. If you found this breakdown helpful and want more deep historical explainers, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop your thoughts in the comments. History is full of stories like this, messy, complex, and worth understanding in full. Let's explore them together.